Excellent.
Nice.
Boy, that's
And we are celebrating Tim's birthday. So here, so they're gonna take us to dance with a live orchestra. I'll say.
oh, that's great.
I know this, but what is great to have friends all around the world. That you don't feel like a tourist, but you are more visiting and living the city with them. It's great.
That is great. And Laura is one of our not only alumni but one of our faculty as well. And her husband Tim is also a graduate. And this is how things work around here. If you go home with Post-its and flip charts, next thing you know, the spouse is taking a class because it looks so interesting.
Yeah, I see a lot of familiar faces and names here. So hi, everybody.
And Renee coming in from Toronto.
Well, I see a lot of familiar faces here, a lot of new faces, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2024 Creativity Expert Exchange Conference. I'm Roger Feierstein, Associate Professor Emeritus in the Creativity and Change Leadership Department at Buffalo State University. And a little bit of history about this conference. In 2021, because of the pandemic, we hosted a virtual conference that we called Mini Creativity Exchange. Well, we called it mini because we didn't hold a traditional conference when people came to Buffalo. Instead, we came to you virtually. And that experiment became the largest creativity expert exchange ever, with close to 300 participants from across the United States and from around the world. And we've hosted the conference now for 2 years virtually, and we haven't looked back. And so I want to welcome all of you that have been with us in the past, and we're going to continue to do this. This year, we have over 280 registered participants at last count from more than a dozen countries. We want to welcome you all from all around the world. And we've received about $1,900 in donations. So thank you very much. A little bit more on history. We have a vibrant community. And as we've been talking here, we create this engaging, this nurturing environment for our students, and they usually don't want to leave. And they tell us how much they miss us when they graduate. And so it was our response to our students' strong desire to stay connected that about 25 years ago, we started an annual conference called the Creativity Expert Exchange. We've been doing it that long. And we call this an exchange because it allows the faculty, the alumni, the current students of the Creativity and Change Leadership Department to share some of their latest findings from both research perspectives and from the field of practice. Well, over the years, we've decided to expand the reach of the conference to include individuals who are doing interesting work in just about any aspect of creativity, both within the Creativity and Leadership Department and from other areas. And so when we use the word expert, we mean people that are working in the field of creativity, facilitating creativity and innovation programs and organizations, and those of you who are passionate about how you can apply creativity in your life. Now, there's a wonderful quote that I came across recently from Alex Osborne, the inventor of brainstorming, our founder, the O in the advertising agency BBDO, and the landmark book Applied Imagination, which we've all read. Right? Osborne said, "Nothing could give me more satisfaction than to teach people how to make greater use of their most priceless possession, their creative imagination." And if you feel the same way, you're here at the right place. And so in the script, it says pause for applause. So I'm pausing for applause. So this is your cue to applaud. All right. Well done. Well done. Okay. Today and tomorrow, we have 2 keynotes and more than 16 concurrent sessions that will be delivered by more than 25 presenters. And in the spirit of sharing cutting-edge work in creativity with as many people as we can, this conference is free. We want to get this out to as many folks as we can. That's our mission. But as we did the last 2 years, the department is grateful for your donations. And while we make the conference free, there are, as you might imagine, costs associated with running the conference, and your contributions really help us to offset those costs. So we thank you for that. Thank you. If you haven't donated yet, and if you'd like to, you can still make a donation through Eventbrite using the same link that you used to register for CEE. And this is going to be available through next Friday at 5 o'clock. You'll just need to re-register and selecting the donation level that's comfortable for you. So with that in mind, we're going to show you a slide about getting started here. So let's begin. All right. All right, so please remember to mute your microphones. Make sure that your name matches your registration. Turn off your camera if you don't wish to be recorded and speak of you in the chat. And gentlemen, please wear pants. Some of our concurrent session presenters later in the program will be asking you to keep your cameras on. Please do so if they ask you to. That makes us feel great. And creativity education, as many of you know, can be transformational. And it was for me. And I moved to Buffalo in 1978 from Colorado to get my master's degree in this department. And I'm still doing this life-changing work. And every day, I wake up excited to be able to do this work. And I believe many of you feel the same. This is about a life passion. We're learning things that can take your life and the lives of others around us much better and much more fulfilled. And so we'd like to show you a video from several of our program graduates about how they've used what they've learned from studying here at the Center for Applied Imagination. And some of you have seen this before last year, but we have some new folks here. We want to highlight some of the amazing things that our graduates have done. So let's take a look at this video.
I was in a crisis of self-confidence, to be honest, when I started. I never thought about entering into a degree of creativity and change leadership. I had my own company, as a small company, a small business. I've been an entrepreneur all my life.
It was interesting. I wasn't actually looking for grad school. I did know that pursuing an MBA, which was an option, did not feed me at all. And in fact, I was like, yeah, I could do it, I'm assuming. But there's no drive, there's no pull for it.
I hired as an assistant professor teaching fashion marketing and merchandising classes in the Department of Fashion and Textile Technology. And creativity was a kind of like a big challenge for me.
I think there were many things happening. At my work, I was saying overwhelmed, and I was feeling like I was not doing something for myself. I need constant change. I am a person that I get bored very fast.
Back then, I was in pharmaceuticals and looking to transition. So transition is something that was a little bit more in alignment with what I saw myself doing for the rest of my life.
So this came to a point in my life that was really critical because whereas I was certainly excited and happy about a new life in the United States, coming from Italy, I was also kind of scared and a little bit lost and vulnerable.
And so what that meant was two aspects of my life. There was a fair amount of dissatisfaction. I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't have any clue.
The challenge, I would say, is being in a position to paddle my own canoe, wanting to have the tool set that I needed in order to catapult me into another direction.
So when this was presented to me, it was really a sweet spot for the point I was in my life. It was really critical enrolling in the program.
I didn't expect that all the courses are very engaging. They really help students to change their way of thinking.
The amazing part of this is that you can get as far as you want.
A lot of time spent in reflection, a lot of interaction, and small team work and group work.
A place where misfits could come and be their unique self without having to capitulate or conform. This is where you can get it wrong and learn from it and leverage it. We have a framework that we get with the program, then you put the fabric on it.
The first aha, the first cognitive aha.
It really helped me to see my role as a leader. I was able to apply whatever I learned from class to my personal life.
I always wanted to teach, and I'm in a way teaching now. I'm actually doing what I wanted to do, and now it makes sense. It really changed the way I see the world.
To make a long story slightly longer, my relationships have changed for the better. Transformative, confidence building, a lot of intrapersonal growth.
This place made me grow as a creative leader. The best choice of my life, I always say, is marry Tim, and the second is to enroll in this program.
It was liberating. If nothing else, this could be that next big thing for you.
that next big thing for you. Yes. And as you've just heard from some of our alumni, there's a lot of power with what we do. That's what keeps us doing it every day and keeps us in this life-changing work. That's our mission, to ignite creativity around the world. And we do that one person at a time. And thank you all so much for being here. So let's overview our agenda. So after I introduce Dr. Molly Hollinger, we will have our keynote address by Dr. Marie Forgeard. Dr. Hollinger will tell you more about our keynote speaker in a minute. And this will be followed by a meal break from 11:30 to 12:15 Eastern time. For those of you that are interested in the graduate program in creativity and change leadership, or our executive credentials, or the SUNY Advanced Creative Credentials, or the master's degree program, a lot of choices there, Dr. Udis and Dr. Pucci will be available to chat in the designated Zoom room during the meal break. And this link to the Zoom room is a document that we've posted in the chat. If you just keep looking at the chat, we'll keep posting those links for the sessions that will be upcoming. We're going to be conducting a more formal graduate program information session on March 22nd. Just mark that on your calendars, March 22nd, from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the New York time zone. And there's a separate Eventbrite registration site for this session, and the link and the registration will be in the chat box. During that meal break, the main room is going to remain open for anybody who wishes to network, connect with each other, bring your meal there, have a meal together, talk with each other. Then our concurrent sessions will begin at 12:15 to 1 o'clock, once again in the New York time zone. We'll have a break from 1 o'clock to 1:15, followed by our second block of concurrent sessions, which will run from 1:15 to 2 o'clock. And we'll do a wrap up of the day and the preview of day 2 from 2 o'clock to 2:15 in your concurrent session rooms. That's today only. Tomorrow, a little bit different. The links for your sessions, as I mentioned, will be in the document. We'll keep posting in the chat box. So if you're looking for the links, check the chat box. And by the way, you're not obligated to go to the concurrent session you indicated when you registered. Now, this is a creativity conference, and so you can change your mind. You can join any session you wish. Just go to the session you want to by selecting the correct Zoom link. We have several concurrent sessions throughout the day at the same time that I'm sure some of you might be interested. I know I am. And don't worry if more than one session interests you. We're going to be able to see all the sessions because they're going to be recorded, and we'll let you know how to access those meetings when they become available. So you got not only one conference, you get 2, 3, sometimes 4 conferences. And tomorrow we recommend that you join us during the virtual coffee hour between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, once again, New York time, to make sure that your connection is working. One more thing, for those of you that are interested in the Center for Applied Imagination, our faculty are hosting a State of the Center presentation as our closing session tomorrow. We really encourage you to attend that because there's some extraordinary, exciting things going on. We're going to be sharing some of the latest activities coming out of the center, such as our forthcoming doctoral program, the Innovation Suite efforts, upcoming events, and currently faculty works. And the faculty is doing some fascinating things. So please go to the main CEE conference room from 12:15 to 3 o'clock New York in the New York time zone. And that session will be held in the main CE Zoom room. So we'll actually close the session in the main CE Zoom room tomorrow at 2:15 to 3 o'clock. And now I'd like to introduce one of my former students, all right, Dr. Molly Hollinger, now an assistant professor of creativity and change leadership at SUNY Buffalo State University. She received her PhD in educational psychology with an emphasis in giftedness, creativity, and talent development from the University of Connecticut. And she's currently interested in the positive outcomes of creativity, such as engagement, meaning, and positive emotions. Let's give Molly a round of applause as she introduces our keynote speaker for today. Molly, so glad that you're with us. So proud of you. Over to you.
Well, so glad to be here. Thank you, Roger. It's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Marie Forgeard. Dr. Forgeard is an associate professor of clinical psychology at William James College in Newton, Massachusetts. She specializes in conducting research at the intersection of clinical, personality, and positive psychology. Her program of research investigates predictors and outcomes of resilience following adversity, with a specific interest in character strength of creativity and openness to experience it. The goal of her work is to better understand how specific positive traits contribute to psychological adjustment and whether these can be harnessed to promote well-being using established as well as novel interventions. Dr. Forgeard received the 2013 Barron Award as well as the 2023 Berlin Award for the Society of Psychology, Aesthetic, Creativity, and the Arts. Her research has also been funded by grants from the John Templeton Foundation. She is a licensed psychologist in the state of Massachusetts and maintains a small private practice treating adults with mood and anxiety disorders, in addition to her teaching and research activities. It's truly an honor for me to introduce Dr. Forgeard, whose work I've admired and followed for quite a long time, going back to when I discovered her dissertation as a graduate student. And it was both inspiring because it was so good, but also quite intimidating because it was so good. So I'm really looking forward, as I know we all are, to hearing about her latest thinking today. If you have any questions for Dr. Forgeard during the talk, I will be monitoring the chat box. So please post your questions in the chat box, and then I will ask those to Dr. Forgeard when she finishes her talk. So thank you. Let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Marie Forgeard.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hollinger, for this very kind introduction. And don't worry, I am also watching your work and very excited that we are interested in similar things. I want to start off by thanking you all for being here, for inviting me to participate in this Creativity Expert Exchange. It's really wonderful to be able to interact with people in the field and people from so many different fields. I think that's one of the kind of distinctive qualities of this program as well, is thinking about how we bring creativity and what it means in a lot of different areas where this is important and impactful. And as a clinical psychologist, right, my background might be a little bit different, but also, as you probably already know or will learn more about today, the intersections between the work that I do, thinking about how creativity relates to well-being, is pretty central to the work that you're also doing, looking at how creative thinking, creative behavior occurs in a number of contexts. So I'm going to share my screen, and this is always where things can go very right or very wrong. So hopefully, bear with me, this will work. I'm going to start the slideshow right here. Okay, I think we are good. And maybe somebody can give me, Dr. Hollander can give me the thumbs up to confirm that everything looks good. Okay, excellent. Glad to hear it. And so for today, I decided to focus my talk on one aspect of my research that has been really looking at how creativity and different aspects of it might contribute to how people cope with specifically consequences of adversity and stress. So kind of an angle on the broader topic of creativity and well-being and creativity and mood, because a lot of my recent work has centered around this particular topic. So I had a little introduction prepared, but I don't want to repeat everything that Dr. Hollinger has already said. So I'll go pretty quickly here. And the main thing that I want to mention is that really in my role, I have the great pleasure of wearing a lot of different hats. This little graphic also gives me a little crown, which might be a little grandiose, so you can just ignore that one. But one of the things that I love about my work is, being a professor, getting to teach my students who are in a professional psychology program. So they're all planning on being clinicians in the future. They're all training to become clinical psychologists. And I also get to have my own practice where on the side, I see a small number of individuals and I'm able to really do the hands-on work of helping people think through challenges that they're experiencing in everyday life. And actually, in almost all cases, helping them think about how they use their own creative resources to be able to build the life that they want to live. So my research, yes, integrates different strands of psychology and is really interested in the role of character strengths and resilience with this focus on creativity and openness to experience, And a lot of what I'll talk about today was conducted not only at William James College, where I am right now, but also the University of Pennsylvania, where I conducted my dissertation, and also McLean Hospital, where I did a lot of my postdoctoral work here in the Boston area where I am. Okay, so I'm going to start by repeating a little bit what the key question for my talk is today. How can creativity help address some of the mental health and well-being challenges that many people experience today in our society as a result of exposure to adversity and stress? And also, how do we answer this question thinking about different contexts, right? It's pretty easy for me as a clinical psychologist to think a lot about how people experience this in their everyday and their personal life contexts, but actually a lot, if not most of people's lives also occurs when they're at work, when they're at school, when they're in all the different settings that are involved in their lives. And so one of the key things for me to think about too as well, right, is the fact that, clinical psychology has been its own field. And for a while, right, perhaps we could think of, okay, thinking about mental health difficulties might have been sort of the province of, clinics and hospitals or personal lives. But I think more and more there's an openness to talking about people's mental health difficulties and their well-being in all contexts of lives. So people might be more likely to talk about them at work, to ask for accommodations, or just to talk about how things are going, what might be helping or interfering with their work. Students are more likely to also be able to talk about what's happening for them at school. And while those things might present challenges for people who are working in those environments who are not trained clinical psychologists, it's also a wonderful opportunity to really be able to recognize and address what's going on for people's well-being. Certainly we know that rates of difficulties seem to be increasing, especially given the pandemic. But there's also this idea that one of the reasons why we see these increases is that people also feel more free to talk about what's going on in their personal lives and talk about their personal difficulties across all contexts of life. And that's ultimately a good thing, even if, of course, it presents new challenges for everybody who's working in all these different areas. And then, during this talk as well, I'm going to try to provide some insights that are based on my program of research to try to think about how do we translate the research in some actionable things that you might be able to do or to think about in terms of how it might apply to the work that you are doing. So I'll start by defining the problem of why, creativity might be an important resource for well-being. And I'll, kind of briefly define this by talking a little bit about how people seem to not be doing well across contexts, which I know is a bit of a strong statement. And it doesn't mean that they're not thriving in other ways, but there's also good evidence that we have that a lot of people are experiencing difficulties with well-being and with stress. And we need to think about how to help them cope with adversity and difficult experiences in their lives. And then I'll talk about what we know a little bit about how creativity relates to adversity, first by thinking about this idea that adversity and stress might contribute to creativity. So this idea of is there a silver lining to the stress that people might be experiencing? And what you'll see is the answer to that question will be very nuanced in terms of how to think about this. And then I'll spend most of my talk actually on the second question, which is, can creativity be used to cope with effects and adversity and stress, and to manifest resilience? And if so, how? What does the research tell us? And then I'll end with some conclusions. So to start, I'll define, the problems that we are encountering in our society and also worldwide. These are facts that you all already know, and I'm just repeating them to kind of set the stage for the challenge that creativity might help us address, right? So you may already know that rates of diagnosable psychological disorders are high, with the most common ones being challenges related to depression and anxiety, but also a lot of other types of difficulties. So what I also want to mention here is I'm going to show you some rates, but this also does not include people who for whom difficulties might not be diagnosable, but are still really important, right? Still affect how they're doing in their lives. So 1 in 5 adults in the United States can be diagnosed with a psychological disorder. 1 in 3 multiracial adults as well, showing that different groups in society might be at different levels of risk for this. 1 in 3 young adults between the ages of 18 to 25. 1 in 3 children, right, also overall. 1 in 2 adolescents. So if we go to this particular season of life, between the ages of 13 and 19, then the rates are higher. And we know only about half of people receive treatment. Only half of the people who need treatment receive it, which of course is a huge issue. These problems have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Obviously, spending a lot of time, at home, not interacting with others, caused huge amounts of stress, not to mention the other challenges people might have experienced during this time. And there's been greater awareness and discussion of that as a result. And these problems are experienced across life contexts, as I was mentioning before. It's in people's personal lives, but of course also at work, at school, etc. How does this manifest, concretely speaking, in these other contexts, right? Well, there's a lot of literature, for example, on the burnout that people experience at work, which is a huge problem, that people are either not enjoying their work, and more generally, when we think about the definition of burnout, it's feeling that you don't have any energy, you're exhausted, you're feeling mentally distant for your job, you're feeling more negative or cynical, and having less professional efficacy. And we know that about 80% of US employees report that they experience stress at work that actually has negative impacts on their mental health. So that's any level of negative impacts, right? So 80% is a very large number. I don't think 80% of people are experiencing, significant burnout at work, but 80% of people are reporting that work is having negative impact on them in one way or another. When we think about the context of school as another example among many other contexts, right? Well, we know that there's high prevalence of chronic academic stress and also bullying, with about half of children at school experiencing this, and also the negative consequences of that. So the reason why I'm going into all of this, right, is to basically highlight this idea that adversity and stress are really major predictors of poor mental health and well-being. They're not the only predictors, obviously. There's lots of other things going on. There are genetics and biological factors, interpersonal relationships, etc. But they're actually one of the best known predictors of people having difficulty with their mental health and well-being. So if we think about also more generally what stress and adversity look like, again, facts that I'm sure many of you have already heard of, right? But actually most people in the United States have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, and really that could, range from different experience of abuse or neglect, parental separation. Lots of different things are included in this, but it's obviously most people, and worldwide as well, more than 2 in 3 individuals have experienced at least one lifetime traumatic experience, and those are defined more narrowly as experiences where someone's life or the life of someone that they know or bodily integrity was threatened in some ways. So obviously, all of this to illustrate, we have very high levels of exposure to adversity and stress, both in the United States and throughout the world. And in this context, right, we come to this with the knowledge that we have about the creativity literature and what we know about the idea that actually what we've seen in our research is that there seemed to be a link between creativity and adversity that we're still trying to understand. And the way that it's manifested is that when we look at biographies and even conduct biographical research, when we hear of anecdotal reports, we can see that many people actually report that experiences of adversity were somehow linked to either the motivation to engage in creative behavior or creative work, or the experience of it. And so I've sort of organized a program of research around this link to try to better understand it. And sort of following some of these anecdotal reports, started off with the question of whether adversity and stress could contribute to increased creativity. Because obviously, that might be an interesting way, right, to kind of reframe a little bit of what's going on with adversity and stress, which of course has negative consequences for people to cope with, and perhaps also might present some opportunities. So as I mentioned before, that's inspired by anecdotal and biographical evidence, much of it the work of Keith Simonton, but also many others as well. And the first study that I conducted on this idea really looked at people's retrospective perceptions of what happened after experiencing major stressors in their lives. You'll notice on my slides, I don't have a lot of details about the research studies because I want to give you a broad overview of my work. But during the Q&A, please don't hesitate to ask for more details as well if you're interested and curious. So in this first study, the design was really pretty simple and mirrored what's been done in an area of research in clinical psychology, research on the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth, which many of you might have heard of before, which is that you ask people to identify a major stressor that they've experienced in their lives. And then later on, you ask them, how do you think you've changed since experiencing this stressor? And in the past, people have already found that most people actually report in the United States that after a major stressor, their relationships may have improved, they might feel stronger, they might feel more spiritual. There's a number of changes like that people report. And so the study that I conducted here really looked at whether people feel more creative after experience of adversity. And absolutely, by and large, this is what people reported in this study, which was an online study of about 300 individuals. And they filled out measures that were already validated and then a short measure that I had also created for the specific purpose of looking at self-reported changes in creativity specifically. So that was really the unique aspect of the study. So the other thing that I found in the study is that perceptions of increased creativity were also related to the degree to which people perceive new possibilities in their lives. So I feel more creative, and that's related to the fact that I found these new opportunities. I started really thinking about something in a totally different way. Perhaps I got involved in a new mission, a new journey. And so that seemed to be very, very closely related to this creative growth journey. Now, of course, right, the main limitation of the study, which applies to actually most of the research on this phenomenon of post-traumatic growth, is that I asked people after the fact. It could be months, it could be years after the major stressor, and they have to tell us, yes, I think I changed, no, I didn't. So people have to do a type of mental calculation that's actually pretty hard to do, right? To remember accurately how you were before you experienced a major stressor, and then to know exactly how you are now, to estimate the change, that's actually a very difficult thing to do. So more recently, and in line with some of the other research that's happening in this area, I conducted a longitudinal study, and the longitudinal research actually did not support the claim that people's ability to use their creative skills necessarily increases over time after major stressors, even though people report that that's the case, right? So in that study, the study involved about 200 people. I had 3 groups, and 2 of those groups, to keep things relatively simple, 2 of those groups had recently experienced a major stressor. So in the 4 months before the beginning of the study, they had experienced something that was highly, highly challenging. In most cases, traumatic. Some other events like divorce, bereavement, financial hardship were also included in the list of possible major stressors. And then I also had a control group who had not experienced such a stressor. And I followed people over the course of 1 year and gave them questionnaires to look at different aspects of creativity, and mostly actually looking at personality. And I had them complete these questionnaires every 4 months over the course of an entire year. A lot of the battery was actually looking at measures of openness to experience, right, as one of our best personality predictors of creativity, and it included other things as well. I'm going to show you a little bit of those results. So I'm going to show you some graphs here. Don't worry too much about the details. You know, the gist of the result is that openness and traits related to creativity actually tended to be stable over the course of the year. You'll see the green group is a group that, the green and the red group are the groups that experienced a major stressor. The only thing that differentiates them is the degree to which they also experienced significant symptoms of psychopathology, depression, and post-traumatic stress specifically. And the group in black is actually the group, the control group that didn't experience either a stressor or a significant psychopathology. So if we look at openness to experience over the course of 1 year, so we can see here at the baseline of the study, after 4 months, after 8 months, after 12 months, really the differences between the groups were not statistically significant. So here I'm like really zooming in onto these lines. So it might seem like there are some differences, but when we test this statistically, we do not find differences. And so I don't want you to overinterpret, right, the fact that the lines are not totally overlapping. Overall, actually, this control group and the 2 other groups seem to have a similar pattern of a similar trajectory over the course of that 1 year. And I found similar things for other related measures. I looked at actively open-minded thinking. I look at the perception of new possibilities over time. And I actually looked at, about 10 other measures, but I didn't want to crowd my screen with too many things. And all of them kind of showed similar patterns of overlap. And so the question then is sort of, so what, right? Because that can feel a little bit discouraging to think, okay, people have these like strong perceptions that adversity might make them more creative. But the data, if we look at that longitudinally, doesn't necessarily support this claim. And so in the second part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about how that might still not really be a problem, because it might still be that people are using their already pre-existing creative skills and their motivations to be creative in order to kind of cope from the effects of stress and adversity. And that is also highly, highly valuable. The other thing that I want to highlight here is that these results are, of course, looking at, on average, at all 200 people in my sample. It doesn't mean that some people aren't experiencing increases in creativity. And so there's also more research to conduct to figure out, well, who is actually potentially able to make the best use of stress and adversity, and what can we learn from this particular group of people? So this is not a study that sort of like debunked this claim, but it's a study that introduces a lot of nuance in terms of what growth may actually look like following experiences of adversity. The first insight that I want to make there, or the first point that I want to make to conclude sort of this section here about the relationship, about the possibility or the hypothesis that adversity and stress could lead to increased creativity, is that one of the things that we really want to do when we are thinking about helping people cope with stress and adversity, and this might seem obvious, but it's really important, is to first make space for stress and adversity, to really help people acknowledge the difficulties and be able to look at what's really happening for them, even when the picture is difficult to look at, right? When people are potentially struggling with some of the effects. And that might mean using techniques including sort of normalizing negative consequences of stress, right? A person might think, well, I should be able to cope with this better. I should be able to maybe find a silver lining in what's happened to me. And actually what we want to tell people is, many people find it very difficult to cope in similar circumstances. There's really nothing wrong with you for having difficulty right now. It's more important for us to make space for what it is that you are experiencing, because it's real and it's difficult, and we can better support you, right, if we make space for it, if we don't deny that. So related to that, also validating difficult feelings resulting from stress, helping people understand that it actually really does make a lot of sense that they would feel the way that they're feeling given what they have experienced. And see, these are techniques, right, that are interpersonal in nature that you may already be using, but that are sometimes hard to use when you're interacting with someone, they're not doing well, and you want to offer them a solution, but actually the first step is to just make space for what it is that you're describing. More specific, though, to the research that I've been discussing, I want to talk a little bit about, so this idea again, right, that adversity and stress could lead to increased creativity, and for us to continue being aware of the fact that cultural narratives that we have about adversity may or may not correspond to people's subjective experiences. So perhaps you're working with someone and they say, oh, I really do feel that my creativity has increased as a result of a stressful experience that I had. That's wonderful. You can support this person, ask them how, help them develop their ideas, and really, be there for them as they explain that. But for many people, right, it may not be their experience. And there is good evidence actually from research that this is a cultural narrative that's most prevalent actually in North America and in the United States, and less prevalent in other countries, including Europe, but also, of course, non-Western countries as well. And so being really aware of that to kind of make space for whatever is happening for people is important. And so, of course, right, related to that, avoiding well-meaning but invalidating comments about potential opportunities that are afforded by major stressors, which usually are really well-intentioned, wanting people to potentially see some silver linings. But if those evolve, and oftentimes they do evolve, they evolve over a very long period of time with a lot of support and a lot of processing. And yeah, of course, this includes opportunities related to creativity. Okay, so then what, right? We still have this finding in the literature that adversity and creativity seem to be linked in some really interesting ways that we are still trying to understand, where many people who have high levels of creative achievement also have high levels of adversity in their lives. And so the second hypothesis that I've been really interested in that actually can help us kind of solve this problem that we have is that the reason why people who've experienced a lot of stress and adversity might be particularly drawn to creative pursuits is that those pursuits may do a lot of good in terms of improving their well-being, their mood, their sense of meaning in life as they are experiencing the effects of stress. So this is more of a therapeutic hypothesis, right? That creativity helps with healing. So it isn't necessarily that adversity might increase creativity so much as people might be really attracted to creative pursuits because it makes them feel better. It helps them cope in a way that's really, really important. Now, obviously, I didn't come up with this idea. Lots of people, especially in the field of the creative arts therapies, have done amazing work on this. And these are just a few of the authors, right? There's like many others as well who have done this work, who have shown that creative art therapies are effective across a range of problems, and also for various populations, including children, adults, incarcerated individuals, people across sort of different communities. So that work has been really interesting, and the literature sort of continues to grow with, of course, more sort of big trials needed to really look at how art therapy compares to other therapies, but still really good evidence accumulating over decades that engaging in creative art therapies is helpful. One of the sets of questions that I've been really interested in that continues to deserve more consideration is to try to understand how these creative arts therapies, and in general, how creative work may have these therapeutic or healing effects for people's mental health and well-being. And one of the reasons why that's important is that if we can answer this question, then we're going to be clearer about what are actually the ingredients, right? Forgive my very sort of concrete picture here, right? But what are some of the ingredients of these treatments or these interventions or these activities that actually make them helpful for well-being? We have less information about that in spite of the fact that we have all of this literature showing that engaging in creative activities is useful when we look at outcomes. So we know a lot about the outcomes, we know less about the processes, so to say. So we want to know about what's happening over the course of the creative process to determine what might be helpful for folks. And one of the first things then that I decided to tackle in order to be able to answer those questions was to kind of look at the beginning of the creative process and specifically take a closer look at motivations for creative work and creative behaviors. So this was a line of research where I started off, and this was actually in my dissertation, I started off by interviewing 56 artists and scientists from different fields about their motivations. I really wanted to get a concrete sense of what it actually sounds like in their minds. What are some of the concrete things that they are telling themselves? We have a lot of fascinating research in the creativity literature, for example, on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which is this extremely helpful and very simple framework, which is really its beauty and its usefulness, that it's so parsimonious. And then I went the other way of saying, I want all the details. I want all the specific fine-grained motivations to know what it actually looks like in people's minds. So I did this qualitative study, and then I followed it up by also having graduate students in the arts and sciences complete surveys on this question as well, to be able to look at this question with a much larger sample of about 1,000 students in 10 different fields. And to make a long story short, basically distilled what people were talking about to 3 kinds of motivations. With the first one being emotional motivations, and I kind of give it a nifty little name to even help myself, help others remember it. So people accessing their inner healer. So people wanting to engage in creative work and creative behavior because it helps them feel better in some ways. So this would be creating in order to express and manage emotions, dealing with difficult personal experiences, etc. The second set of motivations were related to intellectual motivations, so accessing your inner thinker. And this would mean seeking pleasure, stimulation, or satisfaction from intellectual work. And then the third set of motivations were related to pro-social goals, so the inner giver, if you will, for each person, which really includes, really wanting to help other people in very concrete ways, wanting to promote social change or justice, connection between people, perspective taking, and also challenging others in ways that you think might be positive, right? And this framework helped me also kind of formulate other insights about, well, how might we use information about motivations to then help people reap the most benefits of their creative work in terms of well-being? And so the second insight here that I want to highlight is the value of helping people really reflect on their motivations for doing creative work and what that means for them in terms of the potential outcomes that they anticipate and that they experience. So, thinking about why are you or why are your students, your employees, anybody you work with engaging in creative work? And what type of expected benefits might this imply, right? So this will not be kind of a new idea for any of you, right? But we can use creativity in so many different ways to do so many different things. And so it makes sense that it may also benefit us in a lot of different ways. So for example, these are hypotheses to be confirmed in future research, but it might make sense, right, to think about this idea that if we are highly motivated by these emotional motivations, then what we're seeking might be some short-term mood improvements, and we might pick creative activities that are most likely to give that to us. But it might be, right, that if pro-social motives are really high, that this potentially affords us also some longer-term meaning-making, some sense of sort of coherence in, what we contribute to the world, a different way of adding, right, to our life's narrative, and a different way of contributing to our personal well-being. So obviously the emotional motivations are most clearly aligned with this idea of wanting to increase our well-being, but actually all of them, right, contribute to our well-being in different ways. So really important to pay attention to that because it helps inform, both what we're looking for, but also how we might go about doing it, like what creative pursuit exactly are we looking for? And of course, this has implications for, what field we might want to operate in, how we might want to do that as well. Obviously, these motivations are not mutually exclusive, so we also have to spend time reflecting on their integration. In many cases, they might be easy to integrate. We can accomplish all those things at the same time, but there might be some times where they are in conflict and we have to kind of resolve which one to prioritize and how. What are some tools that we have for reflecting on motivations? Obviously, reflection of the type that I'm talking about here, and it might be journaling or offering some reflection exercises or some discussion topics, right? If we had more time, I would love for everybody to go in small breakout rooms now and kind of think about these ideas, how they apply to them, how they apply to different creative pursuits, right, that you may have in your life. It might be that your motivations for the type of creative work that you're doing at work are different than the ones that you have for the creative leisure activities that you have. So all of that is important. But then another tool that I've been involved in developing are sort of questionnaires. Of course, psychologists love questionnaires that might help us actually kind of identify, quantify, think about, and of course, continue to reflect on this. So in my dissertation, I developed a really long questionnaire that was validated and sound, but then later on developed a shorter version of it to make it more sort of practical to implement. So I'll show it to you all to kind of see how you might use that with others as well. But so thinking about emotional motivations, thinking about people on a team or around you, the degree to which they access or they're motivated by a type of inner healer, you might ask them to rate statements about why they engage in creative work. And these statements were rated on, a 5-point Likert scale. I engage in creative work because, so it could be something like, it allows me to express and manage my emotions. It somehow helps me deal with difficult personal experiences. It allows me to escape in an imaginary world. It almost functions like a spiritual or religious practice for me. It makes me feel good physically. It allows me to experience beauty. These questionnaires also really help us understand how does this actually manifest concretely in people's minds? What are these experiences that are healing for them? And I was showing this questionnaire to a friend recently, and they asked me about some of the specific wording, right? For example, they noted, why do you say almost here? It almost functions like a spiritual or religious practice for me. And I thought, well, that's a really good question because we don't really need that word here in this item. But then I remembered the way that we developed the questionnaire is actually that all of these statements are coming from direct quotes from artists and scientists that I interviewed for my dissertation. And so the idea here is that this is really grounded in sort of the exact words that creative individuals gave to us, and helps give sort of more shape, more concreteness to motivations that may otherwise be pretty abstract. So that's kind of the idea here. I will show you all the questionnaire for intellectual motivations. So engaging in creative work because it feeds your intellectual curiosity. I like to be surprised and learn new things because it brings me pleasure, excitement, and satisfaction, because it allows me to explore and understand something I'm interested in, because it's a way to challenge and test myself, because it provides me with a sense of accomplishment. Many statements, I'm preaching to the choir here, that, I think many of us, all of you would probably rate sort of very highly, but also important to note, right, that if you're using some of these tools with people from, other populations, other backgrounds, maybe they haven't had as much time to think about their creative potential, they may be right at different places in terms of their ratings of these statements. Finally, the inner giver, pro-social motivations, which I've been especially interested in, was a big focus of this work, though I won't go into it too much here. But this would be engaging in creative work. So people reported, because I want people to better understand each other's viewpoints and perspectives, because I hope my work can contribute to fairness and justice in the world, because I think my work may have positive and concrete repercussions on the lives of others, might foster a sense of kinship and connection between people, might give them a sense of hope. I want others to respect and appreciate experiences that are unlike their own. There's lots and lots of different ways, right, that creative work might be pro-socially motivated. Of course, even, beyond these items here. And in fact, in the original questionnaire, there's many more items as well. So yes, the second insight from my presentation is this idea of really kind of reflecting on motivations and how those relate then to the work that you're doing. After this work, I also got interested in kind of the next step in the process, right? So we have motivation. People are engaged in their own type of creative work. How do we then help better understand what's happening during the creative process in terms of improvements in well-being, or what might be helpful for folks here? And so to make this transition, I'm going to talk about going from the motivations to the actual experiences, right? Motivations are about the anticipated benefits or consequences of creative work. And then we become interested in also what is actually happening during the work. And so I have a related line of research that looked at this question of experiences. And here I had to make it pretty concrete. And so really kind of looked at short-term experiences during art making specifically. And as a clinical psychologist, of course, at this time, I was also doing postdoctoral work at a psychiatric hospital at McLean Hospital in Belmont near Boston. And so conducted all this work looking at individuals who were going through partial hospitalization because they were experiencing an increase in a variety of potential symptoms during a difficult time in their lives. and looking at how art groups might have been helpful for them. So this is the actual room, right, where the groups would take place. So very simple groups where people would come in a group usually ranging from 3 to 10 people, and would be given sort of an hour to work on any art project that they want and exchange with each other about what was going on for them or the work that they were doing. So it's very unstructured and led by a counselor or a therapist for this activity. In total, in the study, I recruited 175 people to kind of look at their experiences. And based on past research, I looked at 5 types of experiences. There are many others that I could have looked at, but these are the 5 that seemed most supported by past research. The first one is this idea that engaging in creative work might be activating in some ways, that it might give people more energy, basically, which we actually know from the therapeutic literature is really important, especially for individuals who might be experiencing problems with mood and depression. The second experience was an experience of self-efficacy, feeling more confident in your ability to accomplish something, having more mastery. That seemed also potentially to be important. The third one was experiences of meaning making, right? So in this case, through art, can people make meaning out of difficult experiences? The fourth one was an experience of mindfulness, being able to focus, pay attention to something, really be in the present moment. And then finally, the last one were experiences of social connection, which, in any activity that involves other people, in this case, this was a group that people were engaged in, and that may also account for why the experience of the activity may be helpful. The design of the study was actually really simple. I had the participants in the group complete a very brief questionnaire at the beginning and at the end. And you don't have to read through the whole thing here, but each item corresponds to actually one of these experiences that I was looking at, with the addition of also looking at positive and negative mood in general and how people experience that. So they completed this very brief questionnaire, which was also validated against longer questionnaires before and after. And, long story short, what I found is that all of these experiences really kind of improved from before to after the group. So they engaged in an hour of art making, and as a result experienced more positive affect, less negative affect, more general, but also creative self-efficacy. So feeling that you're able to accomplish, in general, your goals, but also your creative goals. They felt more, activated and energized, more mindful and more socially connected. So that's all very encouraging. And when I thought about trying to identify which of these experiences might be even, most helpful in terms of healing, I decided to look at which one of these 5 processes most closely related to changes in positive mood and negative mood, and found the following 2 findings. If I just ran, not to get too deep into the statistics because that might not be so interesting for you all, but if you look at just direct relationships, all of these things are related to each other, not surprisingly. But in this analysis, I was specifically looking at, if all these experiences are controlled for each other, which ones are most predictive of improvements in mood. And what I found was that changes in general self-efficacy related to changes in improvements in both positive and negative mood. And then also, interestingly, mindfulness was related to increases in positive mood. So all of these experiences might be helpful and therapeutic, but it also looked like changes in self-efficacy and changes in mindfulness were especially interesting. Note here, this was about a 1-hour art making group, right? These experiences might differ based on other activities that you might study. So the third insight here is to really reflect on experiences that we have or that other people are having during the creative process, knowing that creative work can be experienced very differently by different people. So when thinking about an activity, what process or benefit might you want to experience or might you want others to experience? And then how do you optimize this considering the activities that are possible? So what we have to do is to find a fit between the creative activity and the process or the experience we want to have. And of course, to really adapt that to context and culture, right? So we're still very much at the beginning of this research, considering the fact that we want to study what creative benefits look like in different activities, but also for different people in different communities. So, this was a different type of session as well here. This would be the session where I would kind of elicit input from the audience as well on, thinking about this idea of fit, what creative, it should say activity here, might best induce each type of experience, right? So if you're really looking for something that's going to energize and activate people, maybe something like dancing, right, might be the activity that helps you best get there. If you're really looking to increase self-efficacy, it might be that helping people or having people work on a problem-solving task might be most important. If you're really thinking about mindfulness, right, having people focus on one thing, and I'm thinking of the arts here, but it could be a lot of different things, but certainly painting, right, might be something that corresponds to that. So again, continuing to think of the creative process in all of its nuances in terms of all of the different benefits that may arise. The last insight here that I'm jumping into is sort of like a pre-conclusion, if you will, right? Which is to really keep researching all of these questions, given the number of sort of outstanding questions that remain in this area. Obviously I talked about some motivations and experiences, but there's lots and lots of other ones to be studied in the future. This was sort of my initial attempt at looking at all of these questions. And of course, we need to do that using appropriate study designs, right? I could go on and on about the different things I could have done differently, or the different studies that should be run in the future to improve upon some of the work that I described. Okay, the other thing in terms of continuing to do research in this area that I'm excited to discuss is the idea of continuing to do this research, keeping in mind some of the things that are happening in the field of clinical psychology, to continue to better integrate the work that people are doing across different areas, right? We do tend to continue to have these silos where clinical psychologists are doing their thing, and then IO psychologists are doing their own thing, and there is so much potential to be had in sort of joining forces. And in general, I would say clinical psychologists have not been very interested in the studying creativity. Of course, that's an overgeneralization because there are many people who are, so I don't want to overlook them, and especially when we think about creative art therapists who have really been leaders in this field. But I do want to say, though, that when we look at sort of classic therapy manuals, how do you do cognitive behavioral therapy? How do you do even more classic forms of psychodynamic therapy? There is this idea that flexibility and creativity on the part of both the therapist and the clients are really needed to be able to help people find solutions to their life problems, and to also be able to thrive and become the most fulfilled versions of themselves. And more recently, some researchers have also talked about this idea that therapists need to be really flexible in the way that they apply more manualized treatments to make them more effective, right? So, classically speaking, right, it might be that if you're interested in helping someone get more energized and activated to address some issues that they might be having with depression, creative thinking might really help you think of activities that people actually want to engage in when they don't want to engage in any activities. They are not motivated, they're really having difficulties with just their general levels of fatigue, and creativity can help you find like the one thing that they will be willing to do and to try. It can also help, of course, find the right metaphor, right, to explain things. This is helpful for both adults and children, but especially I think we find some of the most kind of notable examples when working with children and adolescents, right? So I remember working with an adolescent where we were going to do some exposure therapy to help them conquer some fears that they had. If I had just explained it in terms of exposure therapy, my buy-in was going to be exactly 0 because it wasn't necessarily going to make sense. It was going to seem really daunting, etc. But once we framed the whole thing in terms of Pokemon challenges, then at that point, the kid was 100% in, and we were able to do all of the work that was needed. And so being really flexible and creative is really important to help motivate people and also just understand what's going on. I could go on and on about the use of sort of creativity in treatment, but I think hopefully that makes sense. I do want to say that even though until recently this was sort of described more generally in treatment manuals, there has been a recent increase in interest specifically in the concept of flexibility and psychological flexibility from people who use what are called third wave therapies, which are therapies that emphasize both acceptance and change. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, right? But you know, sort of more classic traditional therapies have really emphasized change. How do we help people change their thoughts? How do we help people change the way that they behave in their lives? And more recently, there has been this focus on, you know, actually, how do we also help people accept some of the things that are really difficult to change, right? And cope with those in ways that still help them pursue their values, make meaning out of their lives, but also hold this balance, right, of accepting some of the realities that they're experiencing and changing what it is that they can change and address. One example of this is a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is one of the main actually modalities that I use in my own work in my private practice, and also when I'm teaching students. And in this therapy, actually, the cultivation of flexibility is central to everything that is being done. I won't go into all of the different kind of skills and components of the treatment that are described in this model here, which is called the Hexaflex, which is a nifty name to kind of integrate all of the elements of a treatment that includes a lot of different things. But what I want you to notice here is this idea that psychological flexibility is right there at the center in the middle. It's really the summary of what is helpful about all the processes that people are working on in therapy. And it's psychological flexibility because on the left, it's the flexibility to accept some of the things that are really difficult, the thoughts, the feelings, the events in life that are there and that we have to acknowledge and contend with. And it's also flexibility on the right here to take actions to engage in change-oriented activities that help us move towards our values, build the life that we want to live. And so, yes, obviously, creativity and flexibility go hand in hand. Recognizing the challenges that we are experiencing really then helps us potentially sort of create a new future, which actually brings us all the way back right to the beginning of my talk. So there's lots of opportunities for integration of creativity and clinical research in this area that I'm really excited about. So in conclusion, right, to try to put all of these elements together, we have a world that's full of challenges for mental health and well-being across contexts. And creativity is a really important resource that can be harnessed to help with coping, healing, and thriving. And we want to reflect these opportunities in our science as well. In 2016, I published a review paper with James Kaufman where we looked at actually how researchers look at creativity. And we found that most researchers actually really treat it as an outcome that's inherently valuable, which it is. It absolutely is, right? That in itself, we can try to predict what leads to greater creativity, and that is immensely valuable. And we also don't want to lose track of this idea that creativity is also a predictor of other things that are immensely important, such as, for example, you know, in this case, well-being, but also lots of other things. So some of the takeaway points, right, from today's talk. The first one, when we think about the relationship between creativity and adversity and stress, is to make space for adversity and stress, really acknowledge the difficulties as they are, not invalidating or imposing cultural narratives around how people should be experiencing those. But then the paradox of that, right, which relates to what I was just talking about, is that when we make space for that, then we're going to be better able to actually cope with it and learn from it as well. The second takeaway point was reflecting on motivations very carefully for engaging in creative behavior. And then the third one was reflecting on the specific experiences that we're having during the creative process, because all of these can be so varied and so nuanced and important in their own ways. And so doing that, right, helps us reflect on how we inform the design and the implementation of activities, and really helps us tailor the creative process to personal and context-specific goals. So this way we're not just, using assumptions, right, to do what we think would be best in terms of creative activities and behaviors. We're really thinking about what it is that we are trying to accomplish. And so across endeavors, of course, we want to think about the role of culture and expectations and experiences to really continue, again, being as nuanced and as sensitive as possible in the way that we do this work. So that's it for today. I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank you again for your wonderful invitation. One of the things I was struck by at the beginning, watching the video about your students as well, is how much you already integrated in this video this idea that we do this work not just because of the potential professional benefits and the accomplishments that we might have, but also because of the sense of personal fulfillment that we are all getting from thinking about how creativity contributes to our lives. And it was just wonderful to hear more about the sense of fulfillment that students have experienced from being in the program. So really a wonderful kind of a introduction and segue into this talk today. And as part of my thank yous as well, of course, I want to thank all of my collaborators, research assistants, mentors throughout the years have made all of this work possible. I'm so grateful. And there's too many of them to name them, but they certainly know who they are. So with that said, I want to open things up to questions and answers, and I'm really very excited to hear about what all of you might have to say about how this applies or does not apply to all the different fields and activities that you are involved with. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Marie. So I'll facilitate the Q&A. You couldn't see the chat during the talk, but you really struck a chord. There was a lot of conversation going on and a lot of questions posed. So we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So I will try to pose as many of those questions as we can during that time. So I think we'll start off just because you sort of touched on this at the end of your talk. So it's fresh in our minds, that idea of like third wave therapies and this capacity for acceptance and change and flexibility. So there was a question from Annika about sort of how can we create that like maybe proactive or preceding like armor to sort of take on those challenges. Is there something that we can do to like develop those capacities to build creative confidence in order to navigate change more effectively?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. And a lot of it is around kind of developing, right, a culture in the team that you work with or the people that you work with, to really be able to even make space, right, for the vulnerability or the ability to talk about difficulties. Depending on the setting that you're in, that might look different, right? So it might be that some teams might actually feel comfortable having a very brief mindfulness practice where they sit a little bit in silence, or somebody reads a statement that conveys an intention for the whole group, where people are able to really kind of connect with what it is that they're experiencing and share with others in a way that feels safe. So obviously establishing, psychological safety is extremely important in the context of making space for stress and adversity. In other teams where it might be a little bit more difficult to do that, right? It might be more of an individual practice of having people reflect on some of these things. So it's not, again, there's not like a one size fits all of necessarily what you might do. But there is this idea of setting the intention, right, for everybody to be able to think about those things. Third wave therapies, especially when they started, the big piece that they were adding, right, this acceptance piece, was in fact really about mindfulness. That's the way that it's been practiced, and that's a word that people can either find really appealing, or on the other hand, might feel almost too kind of therapeutic or clinical or out there, for people to connect with. And so I have found it helpful sometimes to also use words like, we're acknowledging, we're making space, we are just being there with difficulties, we're seeing them. And those words, right, might be more acceptable for some folks who maybe aren't really ready to hear about a concept like mindfulness, even though there's actually no difference, right? I just use different words. So I think there's a little bit of that as well, is just finding the words and finding the routines or the habits that will help people do this work.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one thing that I've there's the the stereotype that researchers say, oh, well, it's a bit more nuanced, than that. That's something I really appreciated about your work, that you are so give so much attention to the context and the individuals. And there was a lot of response to your looking at the motivations behind what motivated people to be creative. So could you talk a little bit about how you decided to look into motivations as an important component of this, how that contributed to being able to deal with adversity and things like that?
Sure, yeah. I think as a graduate student, I was really fascinated by Teresa Amabile's work on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And one question that I became pretty obsessed with, like during the early years of my PhD, was when extrinsic motivations might be helpful, which, Dr. Amabile herself kind of revised the theory to think a little bit about that as well. And little by little, that got me thinking about those pro-social motives, actually. And doing this work, so first and foremost, I was thinking, well, how do I study these pro-social motives? But then I took a step back and thought about, if I'm going to interview people about pro-social motives, I actually want to hear about all the motives, and get back to this level of granularity of just wanting to know what's going through people's heads. And I will say, I think that's how I know that I'm a clinical psychologist, because I'm just so interested in the details of people's sort of cognitions and messages that they're giving to themselves. I mean, all psychologists are interested in that, don't get me wrong. But the idea of like sitting down with people to do these interviews was just really, really appealing to me. So I took advantage of it to just want to know everything about, what motivates them. In the end, I noticed there's a contradiction, right? Because I was saying I wanted to get into more details, and then I come back to, okay, I found 3 motivations, which is, again, trying to parse things down. But, that was part of the point of showing you the scale and the questionnaires, was to say, okay, there's a lot under each one of those categories.
Well, it sounds like you found your calling. And, to your point about sort of generalizing, ultimately, we do want to find, strategies that we can implement, right, and takeaways and things like that. So you mentioned that mindfulness was seemed to be powerful in terms of increasing at least positive emotion in the short term. So there was a question from Amanda also about sort of short-term changes in emotion. She said, how might we manage ideation gone rogue, in quotes, or catastrophizing, spiraling, when one's brain becomes fixed on imagining the worst case scenarios?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I love that it's also a question that's like right at the intersection of creativity research and clinical psychology. It also reminds me, I was looking before the talk at just the program of talks that you have for this afternoon. And there was one on, what was it, the world's worst ideas or something, which sounded really fascinating. So I'm excited for you all to have such a great program coming up in the next few days. But about this question, right, there is this idea that potentially the same processes that are responsible for finding great ideas may in some cases also be responsible for all of the other ideas that come up, including the ones that cause us pain, that causes a lot of discomfort. And I think there is actually value in people being able to express those, because then it helps them actually externalize those. So one of the key skills that we might use, right, for folks who are, and that's a lot of us, right, experiencing uncomfortable ideas that cause us pain, is to progressively learn to diffuse them. And what diffusing means is actually acknowledging them and then finding a little bit of distance so that we don't necessarily believe them, we don't necessarily act on them, we don't necessarily let it guide our behavior. But we still make space for the fact that our brains, often come up with ideas that are difficult, that are catastrophic, etc. So there's again this paradox, right? That if we make space for that, then we're better able to work with that. So I would say in an ideation process, it might be really helpful at the very beginning to state that might be the case, right? So when we ideate, when we come up with ideas, what you're going to find is you're going to have some ideas that you're really excited about, some ideas that you're neutral about, and then some ideas that are going to cause you a lot of discomfort that might be coming from, various places, from your past experiences, from just our mind's natural tendency, right, to want to prepare for danger. And that has some adaptive function, but also when we get really stuck on that, that's not so adaptive anymore. So the purpose of the ideation process is to put all of those out there, to like make a map of everything that is in our mind, but without holding on too tight to any of those at first, because that's not the purpose of ideation. And that's actually, going to help you exactly clench less to these ideas that might be distressing. So you're sort of practicing the skill of expressing the ideas, acknowledging the thoughts, you're not pushing them away, but you're also not necessarily getting hooked by them. And in the second phase, right, when you're actually looking through these ideas, well, that can be really helpful for people to say like, oh, that's the idea that really causes me discomfort, that is more catastrophic in nature. That's the idea that I think might be really helpful for us to pursue for a variety of reasons. And of course, right, at first in this process, people who might not have a lot of experience with this might find it really difficult. They may just be stuck on the catastrophic idea, and they might need some work and some practice to really notice that they can have more flexibility in just letting that idea be one idea among all of the other ones. Yeah, that's a very interesting question.
Great, thank you. And so Amanda, who asked that, said very helpful advice when counseling students caught in that that spiral. And so you touched upon how there are a lot of people in roles such as like teachers, people in organizations where they are trying to responding to others in their organizations or their students when they're struggling with mental health, but may not have the formal training. So is there anything from, you, as you said, also wear many hats, that's been particularly effective with your clients, that sort of expands outside of that, like art therapy into other situations? And there's particularly a question about teens who are struggling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what can be really tricky with that as well, right, is that there is a degree to which it is a good thing, right, that teens feel perhaps more free to disclose things that are difficult. And then a lot of people might feel like, oh, I don't have the training or the qualifications. So, I think first and foremost, this is very sort of basic guidance, right, but also recognizing that if a teen is exhibiting more significant concerns, right, making sure that they have the referrals and the support that they need. So that's, one piece that I'm sure you all already know, especially working in educational settings. But then aside from that, again, really, sorry, I'm being a little bit repetitive as well, but continuing to make space for them and to validate their difficulties. And to let them know, right, that their difficulties make sense, and that you're comfortable talking about it, even if you don't have all the tools, even if you don't have all the resources, that you can be a support and a companion in helping them figure out the path. I think that sense of like calm presence is immensely helpful for anybody who's experiencing challenges as well. So the paradox there is, even without specific training or without specific tools to offer, just sitting with someone and saying, yeah, we're going to figure it out together. It might take a little while, but I'm here, and I'm comfortable with this, even if I don't have all the answers, can be extremely helpful. I think a lot of teens or young adults or even adults, right, I think can have negative or difficult experiences when people say, oh, I really can't help you, go see someone else. That's those feelings of rejection, of course, can be most difficult for people. And part of what we're talking about here is kind of a societal, a cultural transition where we all feel more comfortable talking about more significant mental health problems in a way that's, it's going to help all of us actually be more there for each other, for our students, for our children, in difficult moments. And it's hard. It's really hard work, but it's ultimately a good thing.
Yeah, and that goes back to your point about normalizing struggle, that that we are all struggling, though we may not see it in those around us, that it's not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a question about the motivation study. So Kaylee said, I'm curious about the wording of creative work for the prompt. So did people associate their hobbies or smaller creative activities with that still, or was it focused on creative work in particular?
Yeah, it's a really good question, which, now makes me think, okay, we could do things differently, do another study actually looking at people's lives more generally. But the study was pretty focused on creative work because it was really looking at artistic and scientific work. So in the first study, it was looking at the professional work of artists and scientists in 4 fields. And then in the second study, it was a sort of a larger survey of graduate students in the arts and sciences. And we did orient them specifically to just think about the graduate work that they were doing. Part of the rationale for that is that we also asked them for information about creative achievement outcomes and just other things sort of related to their artistic and scientific work. But I actually completely agree that it would be so interesting to look just more broadly at people's motivations for creative work across different areas of life, because that might also paint a more accurate and comprehensive pictures of how people use creativity for well-being specifically. So yeah, that's an excellent idea.
Well, I'm sure we could keep going indefinitely here. But thank you so much, Marie, for joining us. Really wonderful talk. There's a lot of thank yous popping up in the chat. So thank you so much for being here today. So yeah, virtual applause. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you for having me. I really appreciate it. Really enjoyed learning more about the program and the students. So it's been a pleasure.
Well, just a few announcements before we take a break for lunch. So we'll now have a 45-minute lunch break, and concurrent sessions will begin at 12:15 p.m. You can find the links to those concurrent sessions. So it's a different link from this main room. So make sure you find those. And again, those should be posted in the chat box. And as Dr. Firestein mentioned earlier, you do not have to attend the session that you originally registered for. So if you've changed your mind or forgotten completely what session you registered for, don't worry, feel free to attend any of the sessions this afternoon. Also, a couple of announcements of some upcoming events from our session, which we would love to have you join us for. We have a graduate program information session on March 22nd, so please join us for that. If you'd like to learn a little bit more today, Dr. Puccio and Dr. Udes will stick around in the main room to answer any questions in an informal chat. So for those of you who are interested in the graduate program, feel free to stick around over lunch.
Actually, Molly, I'll just jump in for a second. It's not in the main room. If folks look in the document we posted, there's a separate room for the informal graduate program conversation. If folks want to network and chat with each other, they're welcome to stay in the main room. And then if folks want to join Joe and I for the informal conversation to respond to questions about the graduate programs, we'd love to have them join us in a separate room, which is in the document that's been posted in the chat box.
Thanks, Joy.
So thanks.
And we've updated the Ruth Niller celebration. That will be March 13th at noon, and that will be online. So we'll be sending out information on that as well. March 13th at noon.
Yeah, see how change happens?
Yeah, adjusting in real time. So yes, please join us for both of those events. And more details on the Knoller celebration will be coming out. And so please follow us. We have a Facebook page, a LinkedIn page, an email list. So we'll be blasting out that information through all of those channels. So connect with us in any of those social media channels, and we'll make sure that we send out those details. And then finally, we have a mini C. So we've been having a series of mini Cs around the year leading up to the regular C. And our next one is Dr. Gerard Puccio from 6 to 7 p.m. on April 18th. And again, we'll send out more information on that through our various channels. So please join us for that. So we hope to see you back this afternoon and tomorrow. We have another amazing keynote lined up tomorrow. Our newest faculty member, Dr. Melody Oziaprak, and she'll be talking about creativity and moving creativity from curriculum into practice and implementing creativity on a large scale. So with that, enjoy your lunch. Thank you for joining us. So wonderful to see so many of you here. And we'll see you back at 12:15 for those concurrent sessions. And again, use those Zoom links in the chat box. Thank you.